The War of the Worlds. The War of the Worlds.
Okay, so welcome to this number one episode then of the War of the Worlds Lessons podcasts. I'm going back to the beginning here. I started them back in 2020, March time, with chapter 11, I think it was, because that's where we got up to in the lesson. So I'm going back to the beginning now to start from chapter 1. So we're going to get into this one. Now, for the first chapter, there's lots to say and lots to write down. So make sure you've got a pen ready or a pencil sharpened, and we're going to go through more or less sentence by sentence for this. So do make sure that you've got space to write things down. There's lots to write down, so it's quite cramped, and your book will look very full when it's finished. And if you want to have a pad of paper next to you to write more, then that's maybe a good idea. But you should be able to fit most things onto the page in the book itself. So book's ready, pens or pencils ready, and let's make a start with the eve of the war.
But who shall dwell in these worlds if they be inhabited? Are we or they lords of the world? And how are all things made for man? Kepler, quoted in the Anatomy of Melancholy. Book 1. The Coming of the Martians. 1. The Eve of War. No one would have believed in the last years of the 19th century that this world was being watched keenly and closely by intelligences greater than man's and yet as mortal as his own. That as men busied themselves about their various concerns, they were scrutinized and studied, perhaps almost as narrowly as a man with a microscope might scrutinize the transient creatures that swarm and multiply in a drop of water.
Okay, so let's just pause there for a sec and we'll go through what we've got so far. So the chapter heading then, the eve of the war, is an example of foreshadowing, because of course it's getting us ready for something, the eve of the war. It's the night before the war begins. So the very chapter title itself is an example of foreshadowing, and we find this a lot in this book, where the chapter headings are leading us, building up some tension, lots of tension being built with foreshadowing there. The technical term for foreshadowing, if you remember, is prolepsis, and you can use that if you want to, or you can just write foreshadowing. So prolepsis is spelled Prolepsis, prolepsis, if you wish, or foreshadowing, absolutely fine. Then into the actual narrative itself. So no one would have believed in the last years of the 19th century that this world was being watched keenly and closely by intelligences greater than man's, and yet as mortal as his own. So this is H.G. Wells using a bit of tense here. Now, when I say tense, I mean sort of past tense and present tense. Although it does make things very tense as well, just to get more confusing. So there's different kinds of tense here. So no one would have believed. Now that suggests no one would have believed. So this is in the past. And it suggests he's writing this from the future. Well, writing this from after it's already happened, looking back at the past. So let's just take some time to get our heads around that. He's writing this as if it's already happened, and he's looking back in fairly recent years, as if it happened in, let's say, 2019. If you listen to this now, it's a couple of years ago. So it's like no one would have believed back then that this thing happened. Now that's making it sound even more realistic and convincing. So he's using this present tense, but looking back to the past. No one would have believed in the last years of the 19th century. So the last years of the 19th century, this is worth some discussion by itself. The book was written in 1895, 96, and written quite quickly and published in 96 in a magazine. And it captured the imagination very quickly, because at the end of the 1800s, it was a period known as the fin de siècle. I'm not quite sure if my pronunciation is correct there, if my French is not very good. But it means the end of an age, the end of an era. And it's spelled F-I-N, so fin, meaning end, D, as in D-E, so fin, D, and then siècle, or siècle, is S-I-E-C-L-E. I think there's an accent over the final E, I think, there. So you've got F-I-N space D-E space C, so not C, S-I-E-C-L-E. And it means the end of an era. So the point of that is that lots of books, lots of literature, lots of art at this point, towards the end of the 1800s, was interested in this sort of a bit fatalistic, really, a bit apocalyptic, the end of the world sort of idea. And it was a bit, they thought that as they approached the 1900s and they turned from the 18 into the 1900s, that they would experience, well, I mean, they didn't really think that the world was going to end, but they just had that sort of feeling of, a bit of feeling of doom. And people had it back in 1999 going into 2000. I remember people thinking that there was something called the Millennium Bug that people thought was going to crash all the computer systems. And of course it didn't, but there was a sort of feeling then that this could be the end of an era. So it's become known as the fin de siècle, and it means literature that comes from that period. And of course this is one of those. So this is something you'd probably write in an introduction. This is an example of late Victorian fin de siècle literature. And because of that, it has a bit of an apocalyptic, well, very much apocalyptic flavour to it. This is very much the end of the world. But it wasn't unique. There were other books and other pieces of art and literature at the time, even music at the time. I'm trying to think when that piece of music, is it Holt's music, Mars, was from. I might have to look into that. That might have been the same sort of time. But a very sort of apocalyptic kind of feel. So when you're introducing your answer in the exam, it's good to introduce some context and show that you understand not just what this book is about, but also why it was written. And we're going to be talking loads about the British Empire, about the Tasmanians, and about how the British Empire dealt with and treated people from less civilised parts of the world. But just as a very sort of basic overview, this period in time, as far as literature was concerned, did have a flavour of apocalyptic themes, and this clearly is probably the best example of that. So that's, I know there's a lot to write down, a lot to understand, but I mean, essentially, if you've written down fin de siècle, then, and maybe you've got some space on the left-hand page there if you want to write lots of notes there. This is unique, this first page, because it's the first page, there's lots to write down, so you might want to just do numbers and then put numbers on the left-hand side and make more elaborate notes there if you wish. Not all pages will be quite as intense as this one, so you can afford to use that left-hand page if you wish. So moving on then, that this world was being watched keenly and closely by intelligences greater than man's and yet as mortal as his own. So he's telling us then that the world, our world, was being watched keenly and closely. Now when you use two words to mean the same thing, in this case keenly and closely, there's a word for that, a technical term, which I'd like you to learn, I'd like to use, because in the exam, you're going to impress the examiner if you can use the technical terms. So the word for that is hendiadys. So I'll spell this out for you. HENDIADYS. Hendiadys. And that just means when you use two words to mean the same thing. In this case, keenly and closely both mean the same thing. So H.G. Wells is using hendiadys there to create a more intense experience. We're not just being watched keenly, we're being watched keenly and closely by intelligences greater than man's and yet as mortal as his own. Now that line there, being mortal, is foreshadowing the end of the book, where, as you know from the film, and if you've read to the end of the book as well, you'll know that the Martians are defeated and they are killed in the end, so they are mortal just as we are. That as men busied themselves about their various concerns, they were scrutinised and studied. More hendiadys there, look. Scrutinised and studied. Both words mean the same thing, really. Perhaps almost as narrowly as a man with a microscope might scrutinise the transient creatures that swarm and multiply in a drop of water. So he's comparing us, humanity, the Earth's inhabitants, to bacteria in a bit of water being studied under a microscope, making us feel very small. So you could write there, if you wanted to make a note, comparing humanity to bacteria, basically. Now what that does to the reader, and as it does to us now, and certainly did to the Victorians at the time it was written, was it was terrifying, because it suddenly took people who lived in the most powerful country in the world, as in Britain, and who were dominating other parts of the planet as part of the British Empire, highly successful, and yet making them feel very small and insignificant and powerless. And that's a very strong thing to do, a very sort of challenging thing to do, which is what he did. And you can imagine how a reader would feel to that. It doesn't feel very comfortable even now to feel that way. Although I think we're sort of better at it. I think I think we understand now, more than perhaps they did 100 years ago or so, that we are, one of many creatures sharing the planet, and that we're not so different from, bacteria and other creatures. I don't know. Maybe we still find that offensive. I'm not sure, but you can see what he's trying to do there. He's trying to destabilize the reader by comparing, us as being so-called intelligent species to something just microscopic.
With infinite complacency, men went to and fro over this globe, about their little affairs, serene in their assurance of their empire over matter. It is possible that the infosuria under the microscope do the same.
Okay, so extending that idea then of being now infusoria under the microscope, these tiny bacteria under the microscope. So he's comparing humanity to bacteria. And if we just back up a little bit more, in fact, it's worth mentioning it's a simile, isn't it? That even the one before is a basic simile, almost as narrowly as a man with a microscope might scrutinise the transient creatures that swarm and multiply in a drop of water. So all that stuff I was saying before about being compared to bacteria under the microscope, the essential technique is a simile, but it's a very powerful one because it destabilises us. And he continues that bit further down. But he also mentions that people are serene in their assurance of their empire over matter. And that word empire just means control over things. Like we walk around the planet, we walk around our lives feeling in control of things. And we probably, that's probably true, isn't it? We do feel confident as human beings. We feel like the dominant species. And probably until coronavirus, we felt even more immune and invulnerable until something very small and, some bacteria literally was the thing that's challenged all our certainties about life. So it's certainly very fitting. And then, but that word empire is important because, yes, empire means control over matter, and that means our individual control of our lives. We walk around the world, we walk around our jobs, our homes, feeling in control. But also that word empire, particularly at the time it was written, has other connotations. It means Britain's control over other countries, the British Empire. So there's two meanings there, and I think that's worth exploring because, in 1896, 1898, I think actually, wasn't it, when this was published, was the British Empire was almost at its height of power. It was incredibly powerful. And so that word empire has huge connotations there, and it's worth just underlining that phrase there, because if this example comes up in the exam, which it did in 2017, this exact extract was the one that they gave in the exam. And beginnings and endings are always popular in exams because how a novel opens, how a novel closes are really important parts of the structure of a piece. So it's not impossible that they would pick this again. It is possible that the infusoria under the microscope do the same, that maybe the little bacteria in the microscope in the Petri dish, they, in their own little way, have complete control of their own lives, and they're getting on with things just as we're getting on with things. But if you zoom out far enough, I suppose we do look like ants or like bacteria scuttling about in our lives, and the fact that we feel that we've got purpose, maybe everything feels it has purpose. And so it's destabilizing humanity and making us, the reader, question ourselves in a way that perhaps we haven't done before, or certainly when this was written, hadn't done before then.
No one gave a thought to the older worlds of space as sources of human danger, or thought of them only to dismiss the idea of life upon them as impossible or improbable. It is curious to recall some of the mental habits of those departed days.
So these departed days it refers to there then, this is all about perspective. So H.G. Wells is writing this as though looking back through time to when this happened. It's curious to recall some of the mental habits of those departed days. What he means is that the things that happen in this book, the things that happen in this story, change the way that they view humanity. It changes everything. And I think particularly now, in a post-COVID world, we too feel that. This is particularly timely because COVID changed the way we think about the world and how we interact with each other, and probably our arrogance and feeling of invulnerability, invincibility. So that's what that means there, that those departed days, these days that have left us, these days of the past, it's hard to remember how innocent and how carefree we were back then when we didn't realise what the threat was. So this is all building tension. It's all foreshadowing, prolepsis, building up a sense that something bad happens, but we're not sure what that thing is yet.
At most, terrestrial men fancied there might be other men upon Mars, perhaps inferior to themselves and ready to welcome a missionary enterprise. Yet across the gulf of space, minds that are to our minds as ours are to those of the beasts that perish, intellects vast and cool and unsympathetic, regarded this earth with envious eyes. And slowly and surely drew their plans against us. And early in the 20th century came the Great Disillusionment.
Okay, so this first whole paragraph then sets the scene, doesn't it, for what is to come. Across the gulf of space, minds that are to our minds as ours are to those of the beasts that perish. Now, what's that doing? It's saying that it's like comparing our minds with those of the beasts and the animals in the fields, the cows, the sheep in the fields. We think we're far more intellectual and advanced, and of course we are. But he's saying here that the Martians looking at us from across the depths of space look at us in the same way we look at cattle and sheep, and are highly more advanced than we are, and that their minds are as advanced to ours as ours are to the sheep and the cattle. Intellect's vast and cool and unsympathetic. Now that's a triadic structure. Three things: vast, cool, unsympathetic. So triadic is TRIADIC structure, triadic structure. And it, of course, it also creates that sense of fear, doesn't it, as well? That their brains, their intellects are vast, they're huge, they're cool, and they're unsympathetic. So they're not emotional, they're not warm, they're not kind. They're just methodical. Now also, when you've got a list of things here with the word and in between, so vast and cool and unsympathetic, it's a technique called polysyndeton, which is spelled POLYSYNDETON. Polysyndeton. And because normally you'd expect it to be vast, comma, cool, and unsympathetic, but by having and repeated twice there, it creates an even greater sense of how big and how powerful they are. Their intellects are vast and cool and unsympathetic. So the polysyndeton there works to create this intense effect of fear. They regarded this earth with envious eyes. They're jealous of the earth. And slowly and surely. Now there's a bit of hendiadys there, isn't there? Slowly and surely. It's kind of mean the same thing, really. And they sound similar too. But the hendiadys is operating there. Slowly and surely they drew their plans against us. And that word us is powerful because it's using that pronoun, that personal pronoun, to refer to all of us. And these things are forming their plans to attack. And early in the 20th century came the Great Disillusionment. So what that means then, of course, is that in the 1900s, so this has been written towards the end of the 1800s, but it's referring to what happens in the early 20th century. So it's sort of turn of the century. So to readers reading this in 1898 in a magazine, already a bit frightened of what the new century would bring, you perhaps felt it when we turned the decade into the 20s. It feels like a new time, a new age. Well, even more so when it changes into a new century. And I remember it turning into a new millennium at the end of 1999, and there is a feeling of change and a feeling of uncertainty of what's going to happen and what it'll be like. And he's doing that here, so he's using perspective, time perspective, to create fear and tension for the reader.
The planet Mars, I scarcely need remind the reader, revolves about the sun at a mean distance of 140 million miles, and the light and heat it receives from the sun is barely half of that received by this world. It must be, if the nebula hypothesis has any truth, older than our world. And long before this Earth ceased to be molten, life upon its surface must have begun its course. The fact that it is scarcely 1/7 of the volume of the Earth must have accelerated its cooling to the temperature at which life could begin. It has air and water, and all that is necessary for the support of animated existence.
So we have to remember here that H.G. Wells himself was a scientist. First and foremost, he was a scientist. And so he uses here lots of scientific lexis, scientific words. So lexis being spelled Lexis. And he does that to create a really convincing tone here that this is scientific fact. And some of it is scientific fact. So he gives us some distances, some numerical lexis there of 140 million miles. And he talks about the nebula hypothesis, that the fact it's older than our world, and long before this Earth ceased to be molten, life upon its surface must have begun its course. So there's a rationale here that as Mars is older, it's running out of resources sooner than we are as the Earth. And so the Martians from Mars are looking to other alternatives, just as we are actually, aren't we? Looking at other alternatives of where we might move to when the Earth's resources have run out. So actually, again, H.G. Wells has sort of got his finger on the pulse, really, about how species might look to invade other planets. And it's certainly something which is concerning scientists now. And he talks about cooling and supporting life and temperature, animated existence, toward the end of the paragraph there. So the scientific lexis then adds that greater sense of authenticity. It feels real. This feels like it's supported by real scientific fact. And for that reason, it creates more fear and more tension for the reader. Now, at the end of that paragraph that ends with the word existence, that's the end of the bit that they used for the 2017 exam. So that from the beginning of the book to that point there is the sort of length of extract you can expect to be given in the exam.
Yet so vain is man, and so blinded by his vanity, that no writer, up to the very end of the 19th century, expressed any idea that intelligent life might have developed there, far or indeed at all, beyond its earthly level. Nor was it generally understood that since Mars is older than our Earth, with scarcely a quarter of the superficial area, and remoter from the Sun, it necessarily follows that it is not only more distant from life's beginning, but nearer its end. The secular cooling that must someday overtake our planet has already gone far indeed with our neighbor. Its physical condition is still largely a mystery, but we know now that even in its equatorial region, the midday temperature barely approaches that of our coldest winter. Its air is much more attenuated than ours. Its oceans have shrunk until they cover but a third of its surface. And as its slow seasons change, huge snowcaps gather and melt about either pole, and periodically inundate its temperate zones.
So here we've got more examples of the scientific lexis, with things like attenuated, means reduced, less oxygen. And he's using, real scientific facts here as well. So this was a time of great astronomical advancement and interest in looking at the planets with more developed equipment and technology. And H.G. Wells builds on that. He actually uses what was already in people's consciousness, people, particularly sort of intelligent readers who were interested in following science as he is. He's using that knowledge to make his novel even more real and therefore even more frightening. So what he's doing there, I mentioned before the fin de siècle kind of feeling of fear and doom. And it's also what's known as the zeitgeist. Now, I mentioned, so fin de siècle is a French phrase meaning anything from the end of that century, anything from the end of the 1800s. But the zeitgeist is a German phrase meaning spirit of the age, and it's spelled Zeitgeist. So it means, it translates as time ghost, zeitgeist. And what it means is just the feeling of a time. So, the moment, perhaps, as you listen to this, the things that are in the zeitgeist are kind of a fear of the pandemic and sort of that kind of feeling of doom and gloom that we have with that. So that's kind of in the popular zeitgeist at the moment. And H.G. Wells is sort of riding the zeitgeist of the 1890s in Victorian England at the time. And every age has its own feelings, its own kind of concerns. before this, of course, it was Brexit, and that was very much in the zeitgeist. So he's using the zeitgeist, he's riding the zeitgeist in a way, and you can certainly use that if you wanted to in the exam to show that you understand how H.G. Wells is using things that are in people's popular knowledge and culture to make his own writing that bit more convincing and therefore frightening.
The last stage of exhaustion, which to us is still incredibly remote, has become a present-day problem for the inhabitants of Mars. The immediate pressure of necessity has brightened their intellects, enlarged their powers, and hardened their hearts. And looking across space, with instruments and intelligences such as we have scarcely dreamed of, they see, at its nearest distance of only 35 million miles sunward of them, a morning star of hope. Our own warmer planet, green with vegetation and grey with water, with a cloudy atmosphere eloquent of fertility, with glimpses through its drifting cloud wisps of broad stretches of populous country and narrow, navy-crowded seas.
So you can see there how tempting he makes the Earth sound, with all those adjectives: a warmer planet, green with vegetation and grey with water, a cloudy atmosphere, eloquent of fertility, so meaning lots of fertility, lots of growth, with glimpses through its drifting cloud wisps of broad stretches of populous country and narrow navy-crowded seas. So he's making the Earth sound, to a Martian looking from Mars, where the planet is dying and cooling to the point that they can't live there anymore, how tempting the Earth must look at merely 35 million miles towards the sun from where they are. So more numerical lexis there. Now that shows that H.G. Wells knows his astronomy. He knows distances. And so that adds a bit more of authenticity and realism to the text, because he's not just making up numbers, these are real numbers and real distances. So you can imagine, and I think we as the reader, we would feel the same way if we were on Mars looking at Earth with all its green abundance of growth and fertility. We too would feel that way. So he's really inviting us to empathise with the Martians here, even though we don't really know quite what's happening. We've got a sense that the Martians are looking to Earth with envious eyes because their own planet is dying, and our planet looks so good in comparison. Of course it does, and that's the reason that there is life on Earth, because of course it will support life. But you can see what he's doing there is making it seem very, very tempting.
And we men, the creatures who inhabit this earth, must be to them as alien and lowly as are the monkeys and lemurs to us.
So you can see there again that similarly being used to compare us to inferior animals, so that to the Martians we must seem as lowly as the monkeys and lemurs seem to us. So we've already been compared to bacteria in a petri dish under a microscope, and now we're being compared to monkeys and lemurs compared to the Martians. So you can see how he's using those similes to reduce the status of humanity, and it's very uncomfortable to read that the idea of something being more intelligent than us is quite frightening, isn't it? Because we're used to feeling superior, and certainly back then, at the end of the 1800s, the height of the British Empire, they certainly felt very superior.
The intellectual side of man already admits that life is an incessant struggle for existence. And it would seem this too is the belief of the minds upon Mars. Their world is far gone in its cooling, and this world is still crowded with life, but crowded only with what they regard as inferior animals. To carry warfare sunward is, indeed, their only escape from the destruction that generation after generation creeps upon them.
Now, as you'll know from the documentary and from the critical reading and from the introduction as well, that in fact we if I just hang on a second, we get this in the next paragraph as well, the Tasmanians. So the Martians look at Earth as being full of inferior animals. So the destruction of us would seem unimportant, or as unimportant to them as destroying wildlife does to us. And of course that's how the British Empire viewed lots of less civilised parts of the world, like Tasmania. And if you read about the Black War and the way the British Empire treated these very simple people who lived a very innocent life, and of course put up hardly any fight because they had no weapons as to speak of. And yet here the British were ready to put their flag down and call it their land, and defeated the Tasmanians very easily. And that's sort of the comparison that, well, it is very much the comparison that H.G. Wells is making. And he writes this book because of that. He knows about the Black War and the way the British Empire behaves, and he's a social, making a social commentary really about how awful this is. He's disguising it as a novel, but actually what he's saying is we are the invading attackers. We are the horror here, and to these poor Tasmanians and other countries around the world, the Europeans, the Westerners, must seem like these vastly superior aliens. That's kind of the point he's making. So this really isn't a book about Martians, because there isn't anything on Mars, is there? And even then they sort of knew there wasn't, but they had the potential to be life on Mars, but they knew there probably wasn't. But it's more about us as humanity, and lots of good sci-fi, good science fiction tends to be more a reflection of humanity than it is about anything more extraterrestrial.
And before we judge of them too harshly, we must remember what ruthless and utter destruction our own species has wrought, not only upon animals, such as the vanished bison and the dodo, but upon its own inferior races. The Tasmanians, in spite of their human likeness, were entirely swept out of existence in a war of extermination waged by European immigrants in the space of 50 years. Are we such apostles of mercy as to complain if the Martians warred in the same spirit? The Martians seem to have calculated their descent with amazing subtlety. Their mathematical learning is evidently far in excess of ours, and to have carried out their preparations with a well-nigh perfect unanimity. Had our instruments permitted it, we might have seen the gathering trouble far back in the 19th century. Men like Schiaparelli watched the red planet. It is odd, by the by, that for countless centuries Mars has been the star of war, but failed to interpret the fluctuating appearances of the markings they mapped so well. All that time, the Martians must have been getting ready.
So what we have here is he's using dates, and he's using real names like Schiaparelli, the Italian astronomer, again to give that sense of authenticity. These are real names that people at the time would have recognised, and it adds to that feeling of credibility. This feels like it could happen. This feels like the science behind this. That why wouldn't there be life on Mars, and why wouldn't it be coming to an end, and why wouldn't they then look to Earth as a suitable alternative, as the sort of warmer and more fertile neighbour? And he's even drawing on the sort of in mythology the use of Mars being the star of war and the god of war, and yet that's been since Roman times. So he's really only picking up on that idea that the Martians would start a war. So H.G. Wells is very clever in he's pulling together all of these different ideas, and sort of both real and both legendary and mythical, and he creates a very convincing tone to this start of the novel. It feels prophetic. It feels like of course it's the god of war. Of course Mars represents war, because why wouldn't it? And so you can see he's pulling together these ideas to create a very convincing narrative. And the point of that is it builds tension.
During the opposition of 1894, a great light was seen on the illuminated part of the disk, first at the Lick Observatory, and then by Perrotin of Nice, and then by other observers. English readers heard of it first in the issue of Nature, dated August 2nd. I'm inclined to think that this blaze may have been the casting of the huge gun in the vast pit sunk into their planet, from which their shots were fired at us. Peculiar markings, as yet unexplained, were seen near the site of that outbreak during the next two oppositions.
So there we have the use of, again, real astronomers, Perrotin of Nice, the Lick Observatory, the issue of Nature, August the 2nd. These are real things, and he's referencing real events in real publications, but he's adapting them to say, this flare, this great light on Mars must have been the casting of their huge gun. Well, of course it wasn't, was it? But he's using real events to make it seem like, well, maybe it could have been, because readers at the time would have read of these things in the newspapers and the magazines too, and he's feeding that sort of fear, that kind of, as I say, the things in the zeitgeist, the sort of fear of the end of the century, and playing to that sense of apocalyptic fear that his readers would have had, and that he had too, and that's why he's writing this, because he's exploring what it means to feel that sort of sense of gloom. And maybe it's because, underneath the sort of power, when you're the most powerful empire in the world, there's only one way to go, isn't there? There's only one way, and that's down. So underneath all that arrogance and superiority, there probably is a cultural feeling of worry and doubt of when the bubble's going to burst. And so lots of literature around this time had a similar sort of tone to it, and this certainly is one of them.
The storm burst upon us 6 years ago, as Mars approached opposition. Laval of Java set the wires of the astronomical exchange palpitating with the amazing intelligence of a huge outbreak of incandescent gas upon the planet. It had occurred towards midnight on the 12th, and the spectroscope, to which he had at once resorted, indicated a mass of flaming gas, chiefly hydrogen, moving with an enormous velocity towards this Earth. This jet of fire had become invisible about 12:15. He compared it to a colossal puff of flame, suddenly and violently squirted out of the planet, as flaming gases rushed out of a gun.
Okay, so we know that he's telling us that this happened 6 years ago. So we know he's writing this, the perspective of this is written 6 years in the future from when the event happened. He's looking back with 6 years of hindsight to look back at this. And he uses still lots of scientific lexis here about hydrogen and velocity and spectroscopes and dates. Now, of course, this didn't happen. This wasn't real. This is fiction. But you can see how seamlessly he's moved from real events and real people like Perotin of Nice, the Lick Observatory, these are all real places, and he's moved now into fiction. So he's taken, he sort of got the reader to trust him, encouraged the reader to believe the reality of what he was saying, and then suddenly shifted into these things which aren't fact, but they seem like they're being presented as facts. And so if we go with it, this also seems like it's already happened 6 years ago, and we're now reading the events that happened. So this sort of, I guess if we're trying to put a date on this, it was written in 1896, started in 96, written in 97, and published in 1898 that is. And we get the sense that this is sort of happening at the turn of the century. So if we imagine this had been written in 1906 about something that happened in the year 1900, that's kind of the effect that he's going for. So he's writing it. It's really hard to get your head around, but he's writing it. He's writing it in the past tense, but he's writing it at a time that hasn't happened yet. So he's writing it in 1897, but pretending he's in 1906, looking back at an event that's already happened. So all you need to understand really is that he's using tense and perspective to create a feeling of inevitability. This feels like it's already happened. And that for his readers reading this, it feels like this is going to happen. This is definite.
A singularly appropriate phrase it proved. Yet the next day there was nothing of this in the papers, except for a little note in the Daily Telegraph. And the world went in ignorance of one of the gravest dangers that ever threatened the human race. I might not have heard of the eruption at all had I not met Ogilvy, a well-known astronomer, at Ottershaw. He was immensely excited at the news, and in the excess of his feelings, invited me up to take a turn with him that night in a scrutiny of the red planet. In spite of all that has happened since, I still remember that vigil very distinctly. The black and silent observatory, the shadowed lantern throwing a feeble glow upon the floor in the corner, the steady ticking of the clockwork of the telescope, the little slit in the roof, an oblong profundity with the stardust streaked across it. Ogilvy moved about, invisible but audible. Looking through the telescope, one saw a circle of deep blue, and the little round planet swimming in the field. It seemed such a little thing, so bright and small and still, faintly marked with transverse stripes and slightly flattened from the perfect round. But so little it was, so silvery warm, a pin's head of light. It was as if it quivered. But really this was the telescope vibrating with the activity of the clockwork that kept the planet in view.
Okay, so now we've met this character Ogilvy from Ottershaw. Now, Ottershaw is a real place in Surrey. And Ogilvy, the well-known astronomer, now he's not a real person, he's a character in a book. But by introducing him as such, he's introducing him as an expert. This is someone who can be trusted. This is a scientist. Now, if someone's a man of science, they're probably someone who relies on facts and evidence. They're not someone who's going to be too carried by emotions. And so, generally speaking, when we're being reassured or told something by scientists, we tend to believe what they're saying because they speak using evidence-based theory. So we've got a character here, Ogilvy, and that's important that we understand him as a character we've met. And so through him, we get this description looking through the observatory, looking through the telescope, and seeing Mars. It seemed such a little thing, so bright and small and still. Now you've got that example there of polysyndeton again, bright and small and still. The use of connectives again and again. So you've got polysyndeton, Polysyndeton, and that just reinforces how small and unthreatening it looked, bright and small and still, which is of course ironic given that what happens next. It's sort of building that tension because we know, given that the chapter's called The Eve of War and the book's called War of the Worlds, we know this is going to end badly. And yet here he's describing Mars as looking very small and still and bright and not violent at all. So it's building that suspense, building that tension that we know is going to have to be released at some point.
As I watched, the planet seemed to grow larger and smaller, and to advance and recede. But that was simply that my eye was tired. 40 millions of miles it was from us. More than 40 millions of miles of void. Few people realize the immensity of vacancy in which the dust of the material universe swims. Near it in the field, I remember, were 3 faint points of light, 3 telescopic stars infinitely remote, and all around it an unfathomable darkness of empty space. You know how that blackness looks on a frosty starlight night?
So here we've got direct address. You know how that blackness looks on a frosty starlight night. So he's now addressing the reader directly, direct address, and that makes it seem even more challenging because we're being spoken to by H.G. Wells. The narrator's talking to us here. I shouldn't say H.G. Wells really, because obviously the narrator is a character in his own right, but he's so similar to H.G. Wells, it's hard to separate the two because the narrator is a scientist and H.G. Wells is a scientist, and they're quite similar, and it clearly is H.G. Wells writing as himself, really. But for the purpose of the exam, we need to remember that it is a character, and that's different to the author. So I should say narrator there, but the narrator is addressing us directly, which makes it even more intense that we're being spoken to, and therefore we're invited to agree with him, because whenever anybody uses rhetorical techniques, it makes you want to agree with them, doesn't it? There you go, there's one there, doesn't it? You feel obliged to say, yes, it does. It's a rhetorical question, a rhetorical technique.
In a telescope it seems far profounder and invisible to me, because it was so remote and small, flying swiftly and steadily towards me across that incredible distance, drawing nearer every minute by so many thousands of miles, came the thing that they were sending us. The thing that was to bring so much struggle and calamity and death to this earth. I never dreamt of it then as I watched. No one on earth dreamt of that unerring missile.
So by referring to it as the thing, even with a capitalised T, he's created it into a proper noun. it's even more frightening, the thing they were sending us, the thing that was to bring so much struggle. By sort of not giving it a name, by just calling it a thing, it dehumanizes the Martians, which is fair enough. They're not human, are they? But it dehumanizes them and makes them, well, literally makes them alien to the reader, which is even more frightening because we're always frightened by the unknown. And by repeating that phrase, the thing, it adds even more intensity and increases the fear of what's to come.
That night, too, there was another jetting out of gas from the distant planet. I saw it. A reddish flash at the edge, the slightest projection of the outline just as the chronometer struck midnight. And at that I told Ogilvy, and he took my place. The night was warm and I was thirsty, and I went, stretching my legs clumsily and feeling my way in the darkness, to the little table where the siphon stood, while Ogilvy exclaimed at the streamer of gas that came out towards us. That night, another invisible missile started on its way to the Earth from Mars, just a second or so under 24 hours after the first one. I remember how I sat on the table there, in the blackness, with patches of green and crimson swimming before my eyes. I wished I had a light to smoke by, little suspecting the meaning of the minute gleam I had seen and all that it would presently bring to me. Ogilvy watched till 1, and then gave it up, and we lit the lantern and walked over to his house. Down below in the darkness were Ottershaw and Chertsey, and all their hundreds of people, sleeping in peace.
So he's using these real place names here, Chertsey and Ottershaw. We already mentioned Ottershaw, which is where Ogilvy comes from. And of course, if you were to look on a map, which you can, and there is a map included at the back of this copy of the book, and it's certainly a book that's well worth reading with a map to hand because you can literally chart his journey throughout the book. And he makes a point of mentioning lots of local landmarks and place names. The reason being to make it all the more realistic, because this needs to feel real. This needs to feel like it could happen, and it could have happened. And if you take something like Harry Potter, for example, that's set in what Little Whinging, is it, in Surrey? This is also set in Surrey, but these are real places in Surrey. So Chertsey is a real place, Ottershaw is a real place, Maybury is a real place, Woking is a real place, all just southwest of London, and very much in the commuter belt of London. So lots of people who work in the city, work in London, would have expensive houses in Surrey and commute in by train into the centre. So it's a very expensive, affluent place to live, and still is, very much so. And so that's the reason, we'll come back to that reason later on, but that's the reason he sets the novel here and the Martians attack here, because this is where the wealthiest people in the country lived. They didn't live in London, they lived just on the outskirts, in sort of Greater London, in the nice leafy suburbs of Surrey. And so that's why he starts the book here, and we have the first horror begins here, which is where those who have the most arrogance and the most power, the most to lose, are the ones targeted and the ones hit. Well, not targeted, actually, I shouldn't say that. The Martians aren't targeting anybody in particular. It just happens that it happens to land in the area of the most wealth and affluence.
He was full of speculation that night about the condition of Mars, and scoffed at the vulgar idea of its having inhabitants who were signaling us. His idea was that meteorites might be falling in a heavy shower upon the planet, or that a huge volcanic explosion was in progress. He pointed out how unlikely it was that organic evolution had taken the same direction in the 2 adjacent planets. The chances of anything man-like on Mars are 1,000,000 to 1, he said. Hundreds of observers saw the flame that night, and the night after, about midnight, and again the night after, and so for 10 nights, a flame each night. Why the shots ceased after the 10th, no one on Earth has attempted to explain. It may be the gases of the firing caused the Martians inconvenience. Dense clouds of smoke or dust, visible through a powerful telescope on Earth as little grey, fluctuating patches, spread through the clearness of the planet's atmosphere and obscured its more familiar features. Even the daily papers woke up to the disturbances at last, and popular notes appeared here and there and everywhere concerning the volcanoes on Mars. The serio-comic periodical Punch, I remember, made a happy use of it in the political cartoon. And, all unsuspected, those missiles the Martians had fired at us drew earthward, rushing now at a pace of many miles a second through the empty gulf of space, hour by hour and day by day, nearer and nearer.
So you can see here he's building more tension, dramatic tension here by using this incrementum, it's called. And I'll just find that quote again. Hour by hour, day by day, nearer and nearer. So what you've got there, by increasing in this case, the time, units of time from hours to days, you've got this sense of increasing, well, time, literally. But the effect of that is the increasing fear. That minute by minute, hour by hour, day by day, nearer and nearer they came. So you've got this, again, it's a triadic structure, hour, day, and nearer. These three little pairs have been used here. So hour by hour, day by day, nearer and nearer. So there's a couple of bits to write down. It's a triadic structure, which makes it, again, it increases the tension because it just feels relentless. It feels like they're not going to stop. They're just coming closer and closer to Earth until they attack, which of course they do. But you've also got incrementum because it's the time units are being increased hour to day.
It seems to me now almost incredibly wonderful. With that swift fate hanging over us, men could go about their petty concerns as they did. I remember how jubilant Markham was at securing a new photograph of the planet for the illustrated paper he edited in those days. People in these latter times scarcely realize the abundance and enterprise of our 19th century papers. For my own part, I was much occupied in learning to ride the bicycle, and busy upon a series of papers discussing the probable developments of moral ideas as civilization progressed.
So just a side note here, that H.G. Wells himself was obsessed by bicycles and by learning to ride the bike. And this is why it's so hard to see the difference between the narrator and H.G. Wells, because it is very, very autobiographical. Well, insofar as the characterization is concerned, obviously it's not autobiographical in the fact that aliens didn't invade H.G. Wells' life, but the narrator in the book is certainly heavily based on H.G. Wells' own life.
One night, the first missile then could scarcely have been 10 million miles away, I went for a walk with my wife. It was starlight, and I explained the signs of the zodiac to her, and pointed out Mars, a bright dot of light, creeping zenithward, towards which so many telescopes were pointed. It was a warm night. Coming home, a party of excursionists from Chertsey or Isleworth passed us singing and playing music. There were lights in the upper windows of the houses as the people went to bed. From the railway station in the distance came the sound of shunting trains, ringing and rumbling, softened almost into a melody by the distance. My wife pointed out to me the brightness of the red, green and yellow signal lights, hanging in a framework against the sky. It seemed so safe and tranquil.
Okay, so there we have it. The end of that first chapter, and the last sentence there, it all seems so safe and tranquil, is a really good quotation to underline and to have. One of the ones you'll want to revise for the exam, I would say, because it's such an important one. It seemed, past tense, it seemed so safe and tranquil. The obvious dramatic irony being that it wasn't safe and tranquil, that actually we know this chapter is called The Eve of War, we know the book is called War of the Worlds. It was anything but safe and tranquil. We've just heard descriptions of these things flying towards Earth from Mars down Ogilvy's telescope, and yet it seemed to them, having a nice walk on a summer's evening, so safe and tranquil. And there's even hendiadys there with the words safe and tranquil. Both of those words mean the same thing, essentially. So there's hendiadys there as well, used by H.G. Wells to create a greater sense of dramatic irony, I think, for the reader. that when we hear those words safe and tranquil, we know as the reader that it's not, and we're almost wanting to scream out to them, watch out, because something bad is going to happen. We know that as the reader, having only read the first chapter, and he knows it too, of course, because he's writing this from the future, looking back 6 years ago, in this fictional world, and it sort of adds to that sense of doom that this is it seemed safe and tranquil back then in these happy carefree days. It adds to that sense that this is going to happen. This is inevitable. So there's lots to write about that. The ending of that first chapter there in particular, and that takes us into the next chapter. Okay, so I'll leave it there for now and see you for chapter 2. Bye.